Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm happy to be here with real estate guru Mike Pepper from the Hinge team. We are excited about this topic because there are a lot of opportunities to use your real estate in the health of your company and then the growth and exit of your company. And it can often get complicated. There are several different ways you can use your real estate and different vehicles you can use to buy and sell real estate. We had a great conversation at our Shift conference. For those of you who were there last week, we introduced some high-level concepts around real estate, and we have some great content for you today that we're excited to share. Before I turn it over to Mike, I would like to tell you about a couple of things. First of all, the Hinge team, if of interest to you, is always happy to support with the current value of your business and real estate. That'll kind of get you jump started into what can I do in the future and how can I use the resources that I have in the growth or exit of my company. So definitely call on the Hinge team if that's of interest. We have a very solid buyer group for those who are exiting. We just gain more every week, lots of interest in our industry. That makes me super happy for people who have built an amazing business and, are tired. I feel that way sometimes too, but maybe a little tired, want to let the operation go to somebody who can take care of it in the way that you feel good about. Also, transaction management is what we do for real work. We do this for fun because we like you guys, and we're happy to bring great content, but always happy to support you with transactions. We just finished our 2023 Shift conference last week. We all are energized again. We're super excited about next year's venue, which is Santa Barbara, California, this beautiful Ritz-Carlton property. We're going to have the run of the property, meaning it's just us. It's gorgeous. We want to have an amazing time meeting people. We want to really show you guys how you should be treated. So we are excited about that. Put it on your calendar. We expanded to 400 participants this year. We ended up with 200 on our wait list. We're going to 500 next year. You guys might be surprised that, like I was, that it's really hard to go much over that and have a very high quality venue, which is what the Hinge team likes to create. So we are going to expand it, but we will sell out. And it always, I'm grateful, and also I feel terrible because I want everyone who wants to be able to be there. So look out for that. We have just launched our 2024 Leadership Sprint Series. We might actually be full already, but if you are interested in knowing more about that or to get on the wait list with Tom, scan the QR code here. Tom will get back with you, arrange a phone call with you to explain the concept and how it works. Be sure that he gets aligned and at least gets you on the wait list. We've also just launched our 2024 Mastermind Series. We had a great time with that this year. We have leaders from all over the country in super regional size companies to single site companies. And we matched people with a group that they could brainstorm their company's health and issues with. And just so happy with that we just launched a year-long series for 2024. And that's getting full pretty quickly too. Those are all led by leadership coach Alita Mechtel, whose company we sold a couple of years ago, and now we're grateful that she's on our team. So check that out. Also financial services. We've got some financial coaching and QuickBooks training going on. So just to let you guys know about all of those opportunities, the mission there is for us to help you be as financially healthy as possible today. to put in some solid strategies to build the value in your business and real estate, so that when the time is right, you go out at the very best possible way that you can. That's our mission. It's what we want from you. We don't like to get the phone call when somebody's in trouble and they need to exit really quickly. We like to get the phone call that says, I am rocking it over here. I've done all the right things. My value's maximized. See what you got for me. So that's what we want for you. Besides that, even if you don't have that in mind, running a financially healthy company gives you the resources you need to do your mission, support your people, and create excellent programs for children and families. You can connect here, watch us on Facebook and Instagram. It's where events like this webinar and our Thrive one-day financial deep dive that's coming up in the spring and other offerings are announced. So love to see you there. I am very, very happy to introduce Mike Pepper. Mike has a very long history in real estate, also in childcare real estate, which is one of the reasons that we nabbed him and brought him over to the Hinge team. And we're grateful for all that brain space and knowledge and care that Mike brings to the team and to our clients. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike. I'm going to ask that he tell you a little bit about his history so you can kind of relate to where he's been and his journey toward helping childcare owners understand and make the very best decisions for their real estate. Mike also, of course, manages business transactions, but he is one of our strong real estate gurus. So I am going to turn it over to Mike. Thank you for being here, Mike. Please put your questions in the chat. We will make time at the end for your questions, and I'll monitor those and be sure that we're getting you the information you need and driving this in the right way. So thank you, Mike. I'll let you take it over.
Thank you. I just want to check the sound level. Everybody can hear me okay, I hope. And so today we're going to talk about how to use your real estate for the best possible results. And my background is in the commercial property arena. I actually built several schools for a tenant in the Denver market. I have a long background working for a variety of different commercial real estate enterprises, pension fund, developer, syndicator. I also spent early part of my career in banking for commercial real estate projects. So I have a wide background from a variety of different viewpoints, and I enjoy bringing those viewpoints to help our clients. Today's discussion will be at a high level with a couple of nuggets, hopefully, for you to think about. Here's our table of contents. I'm going to give you some of my overall observations on the market. You can see I've got a little bit of gray hair. I've been through some cycles, and hopefully I can offer some long-term perspective as well as some immediate short-term analysis. We'll talk about some of the recent trends. I want to spend some time talking about what really determines value for folks. And I don't want to short circuit those individual components of value. Then we'll offer some ideas for those who are currently in the business and are operating schools. And these are ideas for what you can do with your real estate that currently is in your portfolio, as well as if you're in a growth mode. And of course, if you're thinking about succession planning, how to use your real estate to optimize your family wealth. We also have some folks who are not school operators, but they're investors in childcare property, and they have a little different perspective on it. So we want to offer some ideas there. And then, of course, we'll have a summary, and we'll summarize some of the ideas and give you some food for thought going forward. So let's dive in, and we'll look at some overall these are personal observations. Kathy and I talk about these things all the time. And let's talk about some of these ideas. So childcare real estate used to be neglected folks were more interested in multifamily apartments or restaurant uses or banks. And in order to get attention for a childcare building, your cap rate, which is a ratio of the rent to the value, the cap rate offered would have to be higher. And so a cap rate, for those of you who don't know, a cap rate is like a return on investment. And the rule of thumb used to be, well, I'm not really interested in a special purpose school, for goodness sakes, unless I can get a really good return at 9%, 9.5%, 10%. And over time, over the last 20 years or so, the idea of the stability of those assets and the scarcity of those assets, combined with the increase in buyer attention of those assets, has resulted in a steadily declining cap rate environment for those assets. So this certainly benefits our owners and our sellers, who don't need to offer such a high cap rate, implying a lower price given a certain amount of rent. And so that's been favorable for our industry. Many of the public real estate investment companies like Realty Income out of Southern California, or Store Capital, even Essential Properties, have a large portion of their portfolio invested in childcare assets. And combined with the 1031 buyers who were looking for long-term stability, this has resulted in a growing acceptance of the childcare facilities in the investment community. Cap rates for apartments and credit-oriented leases on credit, high credit banks, for example, or auto parts stores, those are still considered, probably superior, because if your bank leaves, you probably can backfill it. Apartments are highly in demand, although there's a management issue. But cap rates on schools have declined as the cost of money has declined, and we'll get into that in a minute. But when people say, gee, what's the cap rate on my building? There's a range, and where that range used to be 8.5 to 9.5 or 8.5 to 10, we can now say that it's 7, 7.5, 8, 8.25. And there's a wide variety of buildings available. There are a number of operators that are doing new build-to-suits around the country. There's a lot of aggregation of mom and pop sellers that are selling out to the larger companies. Many times they're selling their properties as well. The Sun Belt has obviously been very active. We're seeing a lot of attention go back into the Midwest and overlooked markets. So there's a wide variety of childcare buildings available. And we will offer some ideas here on how to take advantage of today's circumstances. Next. Now, while we look at the market, we do want to be careful about some of the challenges out there. And, a good investor understands the benefits and also looks at, managing the risks. So when we look at the risks today, the biggest one, in my opinion, is increase in interest rates. And that's obviously affecting everybody. It's on the news. Well, I'll have a chart here later talking about historical interest rates, but the rise in interest rates puts a chill on the valuation of your school building. And it has a negative impact on the overall economy. And as a result, it could potentially disrupt the customer acceptance of your school business. So we want to really pay attention to interest rates and figure out, is it going to continue to increase with the rest of inflation? Have we reached a peak? Of course, if we knew the answers to all these questions, we would probably be in Vegas. But interest rates are something that we can't ignore. Another issue is when we look at the impact on the staffing of some of our colleagues, without the proper amount of staff, we may have a dark classroom. And with a dark classroom, we don't have the revenue that we should have, and our ability to pay rent or service a mortgage might be challenged. So we need to understand how we're going to overcome the staffing issues. And when we're looking at a potential exit of our school business and keeping the property or selling the property, we need to understand, are we able to effectively trust the next operator to operate it? Or if we're just going to keep the business and sell the building, do we have comfort in ourselves to properly staff this building? With respect to overbuilding, I feel this is a consideration for the Sunbelt states. There are certain markets where we look at and we feel like, gee, there's a lot of new shiny property and it looks great, but it might not be full. And so be careful in places like Texas and Georgia and Arizona. And certainly if you find a terrific infill location for your school or your business is already there, that's great. If you're on the outskirts or you're in the future path of growth, I would be just a little cautious to make sure that you're getting in at the right number and you feel comfortable that the path of growth will indeed catch up with you. As compared to some locations where we talk about a childcare desert where there's not enough sites, that could be a factor of demographics or there's no land. And like I mentioned earlier, we are seeing a return to the Midwest where maybe prices aren't so expensive and you may not have the population growth, but you certainly have demand. One of the other challenges we see is the politics around government involvement in pre-K education, and some states call it transitional kindergarten. So it's important that we understand whether our operators are competing against the government or partners with the government. And in some states, it's a public-private partnership, and it ensures that our children are staying in the building for as long as possible. In other states, California, the government seems to be intent on offering free TK services. Whether that's a good deal or not is still, I think, an open question. Free may not be a good value, but it is competitive. So the smart investor and the smart seller, the smart buyer needs to understand these challenges. Let's talk about the next slide.
So Mike, could we take one question on this
Yes.
slide before we leave it? So the question is, how has the rise in interest rates affected cap rates for recent transactions?
Yes, so we do have some discussion on that later, but I'll touch on it briefly. The rise in interest rates has caused cap rates to increase, but there is a lag. At our Shift conference in Charleston, we had commentary from some of our professionals on one of the panels that talked about interest rates going up 3.5% to 4%. And the rate we're talking about is both the Federal Reserve rate, as well as the prime rate, as well as the 10-year T-bill rate. However, the anecdotal evidence is that cap rates have only gone up by 1 to 1.5% of that. So we feel that, my personal opinion is that cap rates will continue to increase because the cost of money has increased. There is a lag, however, because there are many 1031 buyers out in the market who don't need financing and are pursuing a tax advantage strategy versus a pure investment strategy. So their cost of money is lesser of a concern? We'll cover that question in a minute. Okay, next, please. So we would be on page 10, 11.
I am sorry, did I go backwards?
That's stuff happens. Next one. There we go. Okay,
Ta-da.
there we go. So here was the answer, but I appreciate the listener being ahead of the game. So we'll talk a little bit about the cost of money, and let's go to the next slide, because here's a chart that gives folks an idea of the historical 10-year T-bill. So this chart shows the price of the 10-year T-bill. And currently we're at roughly 4.5, 4.6, I think. And if you go back 60 years, you'll see how the price of money is actually a lot lower than it has been historically. You can see the spike in the late 70s, early 80s. These were the Paul Volcker years when, prime rate was through the roof and it was very difficult to get conventional financing. A lot of commercial property and residential property was sold using owner carryback financing. And in the Greenspan years and the Reagan presidency, our debt increased a lot, but the price of money went down. And over the last 20 years, our cost of money has declined incredibly. So when we see this uptick here in the last couple of years, people are complaining about it, but I feel like a historical analysis is important here. And many folks say, gee, the cheap cost of money resulted in an overinflation of asset values. And I think there's some merit in that. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is a 4.5% T-bill rate an anomaly or a reversion to the mean? I might argue it's a reversion to the mean. All right. And these slides are available for the audience too, if you want to let us know. All right, let's take a look at the next slide, please.
Mike, I'm gonna slide one more question in on you.
Yes.
What demographic metrics do you use to measure the potential for overbuilding? Great question.
All right. So, one person's overbuilding is another person's ease of entry into a market. So I guess when I consider overbuilding, I look at things like, are you able to achieve a break? So let's take a brand new building in a Sunbelt state of, I don't want to cast aspersions on any particular state or metro, but let's say you have, you're the operator and you have a brand new building in the Sunbelt and it's open for business and you're not breaking even yet. And it's now 12 months or 18 months into it, and you're not breaking even on your staff costs and your real estate costs, and you're struggling with competition. I would say that a break-even point longer than 12 months is one definition of overbuilding. I would argue that the availability of too much land on the next freeway off-ramp outside your city center is an example of a potential for overbuilding. I would argue that a plethora of new childcare developments that are put up by a franchise without much of a corporate guarantee and a developer who's quickly trying to put that lease on the market to sell prior to operating history showing evidence of acceptance by the customers is an example of overbuilding. That's how I would define it. It's a combination of subjective and objective measures. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So here's an example of some of the math of how the increase in interest rates would negatively affect your building value. So the people ask me, what's the cap rate? What's the cap rate on this deal? And the cap rate is a negotiation between a buyer and a seller. A cap rate is a indicator of the cost of money. Typically, our cap rate's going to be a little bit higher than the 10-year T-bill rate. In some cases, a building may be offered for sale, and we know the rent, and we see an asking price, and we then derive a cap rate from it. So we want to analyze, if we buy that building, are we willing to live with the asking price and the derivation of a cap rate, or do we need a higher cap rate, a higher return on investment, indicating a lower price? So let's assume we have a 10,000 foot building. The rent is $200,000 a year. It's in Anywhere Town, USA. And 3 years ago, this building might have been offered for sale at a price of $3,076,000, which would indicate a cap rate of 6.5. And now I would argue that today's investor probably isn't going to want to buy that building unless there's something incredible, which I'll get to later. But I would argue that generically, the cap rate might be more like a 7.5, which would indicate a $2.6 million value, or a decline of many hundreds of thousands of dollars for a 1% differential. And you can see how there's a gearing effect, or a magnifying effect, where a slight change in the cap rate really has a big impact on the value. Next slide, please. So here is a snapshot of the very most recent increase in our 10-year cost of money. And I wanted to show a blow up of the most recent activity, because certainly over a 60-year time period, you could see the gigantic swings here. But even in the last couple of years, if you look at January 1st of 2021, our 10-year cost of money was in the 1% range. Obviously, that was terrific if you were borrowing money. It did have an abnormal impact on asset values, because if you could buy more money for cheaper rate, then you could go invest in assets, and sellers were taking advantage of that. So the increase in the 10-year cost of money here is quite dramatic. So we've gone from 1% in the beginning of 2021. We were barely at 2% in 2022. That was a doubling of the cost of money, but we're still at 2%. And then in January of the beginning of 23, we're touching 4%. So it doubled again, but historically 4% is still well below where it's been for the last 40 years. Now we're at 4.5. There's a lot of macro noise out there. My guess is we're going to be flat to slightly increasing. We do have a presidential election coming up. Who knows what's going to happen? But as a result of the 10-year money going up so much, banks and other lending sources, SBA, even private sellers, have to increase their debt rates. And this is going to have an increase. It's going to result in an increase in cap rates. Next slide, please. All right, so here's some other observations that we have. One piece of good news is that we learned through COVID and through the last, even after COVID, whereas office work could be done remotely. Childcare work is not. Children need to be in the building. And as a result, customers will pay for their children to be in the building. This is good news for those who operate schools in a building. And it means that those buildings that are and those programs that are well run will have customers. Many of our customers have wait lists, and I would feel good as a landlord and even as a building owner when I know children are coming to the building, parents are paying, there's going to be money there to pay rent. Across our industry, over the 10 years I've been with Hinge and over the 30 plus years that Kathy's been in the business, there's an increasing sophistication in the market. We used to use the term mom and pop, and certainly there are many mom and pop and local entrepreneurs who are quite sophisticated, are using modern systems, modern techniques, but there's more regional and national groups that are able to take best practices and turn this from a focus on education and curriculum and managing their business by looking at their checkbook to a more sophisticated financial analysis, a more long-term analysis, managing by using budgets, managing by using our framework mechanism, and taking a more business approach rather than strictly an education approach. The involvement of government is a new phenomenon in some of the states. For other states, it's been around for a long time, but operated in the background. I feel like there's a lot more publicity about it, but even in red states where there are new funding programs, that tells me it's time to pay attention. For those who were at the SHIFT conference in Charleston, there was a trick question offered up by Phil Vaccaro from our consulting colleague. And his question was, which state has had the most per capita increase in funding? And the answers were either California, New Jersey, Alabama, or Texas, if I remember the question correctly. And of course you might think, well, it's a blue state. And the answer was Alabama. So when you see that happening, our encouragement is get together at your local level and understand the state and local programs. There's a lot of talk about the federal funding cliff and how that money's going to terminate, but there's enough other sources out there. And there are also some non-governmental organizations that have funding. We talked about overbuilding, but I think that it's important to also look at the evolution of the childcare world, and new buildings continue to come online. Some of the older Class C buildings that aren't functional anymore probably need to be repurposed and become something other than childcare. We certainly like talking with architects and developers about how to build new purposely built childcare centers where there's more light, there's easy access to the outside, they're more welcoming for parents. Those cost money, for sure, but for moms and dads coming into a building and they see that it's brand new and clean, that certainly has an appeal. Of course, there's a cost equation that has to go into it, but we are seeing a lot of new buildings in the pipeline. I put this last bullet point on here so people can understand the relationship between the cost of construction and the rent. So we do have a lot of clients who don't have the capital or the interest or the expertise to build their own. And there are certainly some advantages to hiring this function out. For those operators then who do connect with a developer, we need to, the key question is, what is your rent factor, sometimes called a development cost factor? If it costs me $1 million to buy the land and build the building, how much am I going to have to pay in rent? The old answer used to be 10%. The new answer was 7.5 to 8. And with the rise in interest rates, that development cost factor is now moving back to the historical mean of closer to 10%.
So Mike, can we pause for a couple more questions?
You bet.
Okay, I will tackle one real quickly. The question is, have we seen a rise in license exempt programs that are really hard to compete with? The factor that makes those generally hard to compete with is they're usually in facilities that they don't have to pay for. Let's call them the public school or churches, and maybe there is a rent factor. It's usually not at market rent, so it really makes it difficult to compete from a financial perspective. I will say I have not seen an overall rise. I will say that my experience has been that you should try to compete on quality of programming and not price. So obviously you have to price differently if you have costs that are higher. Mike, talk a little bit more about how to evaluate markets to enter. You addressed this from a competition standpoint. Someone else had a question about what the demographics look like. I know that a lot of our fast-growing companies have specific markers for things like 0 to 4, number of 0 to 4 in the market versus childcare slots. And I don't know that there's a normalization of those numbers, but do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I think that with respect to the 0 to 4 demographic, I've heard from a lot of different operators, some of the key opinions on this, and these are opinions, not facts. The savvy operators assume that half of the 0 to 4 children are cared for by a relative or in-home or have some other mechanism. And that only half of the 0 to 4 population seeks outside childcare spots in a traditional center. I've had customers that go into a 3 and 5 mile radius and do some granular addition of how many childcare centers are operating in that market and compare the total number of available seats versus the implied demand. We also have clients who look at average household income, and they're looking for a band that's usually a little bit higher than the average household income for that state, but not too high where the overabundance of people could afford their own nanny. We also have clients who look at the education achievement of the parents, where the more educated parents are more likely to prefer a childcare for their children at an earlier age.
Okay, thank you, Mike. One more, and then we have several. So those other guests who have asked questions, we got you. We'll answer your questions. But one more. Are you seeing any demand from buyers to revert back to CPI increases versus a flat increase?
I like that question. It depends on where you sit. For operators who are selling their school and the building, we have seen tension and a debate with the buyer, where the business owner who also owns the property wants higher than 2.5 to 3% CPI increases, because inflation has been 8%, maybe it's down to 6%. But the old days of a 2.5 to 3% bump don't necessarily work anymore. Obviously, the business buyer feels like they're paying market value for the business, and they don't want to have, for 15 years, annual increases each year that are 5 or 6%. So many of the buyers who will become tenants want to see that CPI get fixed at 2.5 or 3, the lesser of CPI or 3%. Some of our national groups because of their superior credit, they want the rent flat for the first 5 years. And then in year 6, there would be an 8 to 10% bump. That's not something we favor, but feel like you have to look at it holistically. If they're paying a strong price for your business, and you're keeping the building, you certainly want the rent to be sustainable. Nobody wants to have a default on rent in year 5 and have an ugly negotiation. All right, so we've got about 7, 8 pages left. We'll be brief here. Many of you know these topics, but we wanted to make sure that we are bringing them for full discussion here. So when we talk about trends in real estate, when we've talked about interest rates and some of the politics and some of the current conditions, but we also want to talk about trends that are, I guess maybe trend is the wrong word, but things that are constant. And obviously the quality of your property, the credit worthiness of the tenant, we talked about the cost of money. Those things don't go away. Do we have a quality building or not? Do we have a good credit-worthy tenant or not? And finally, we want to talk a little bit about something that maybe doesn't get a lot of attention, which is what are the psychological and emotional motivations of the buyer and seller on each side of a transaction? Next, please. So you guys know these things, right? Real estate is location, location, location. But here, let's really think about what are we trying to achieve? We don't really need to be on the main and main, probably can't afford that kind of land. Price, we got traffic whizzing by too fast. That's where your gas station goes, your bank, your CVS, your Target. But being right behind the Target on the subsidiary street might be a good location. Maybe near an elementary school. That might be a good location. And my speech here is both for those that have an existing building, as well as, let's say, your demographics have changed and you want to relocate your building, or for those who are building a new building. You know, I would encourage you to drive the neighborhood and drive for 3 or 4 minutes down each north, east, west, south axis. Don't just circle in the immediate area. Age, newer is better, usually. Not always, but usually. And functionality is a key concern. We do have some of our 1031 buyers that focus on how long is the lease, but let's remember that, and I live this as a developer, a lease is a promise for future performance and the right to chase somebody who's not paying. The lease is a promise of performance. And if that tenant goes out, what can I use my building for? Who would want it? Do I have to fix it? I don't think that gets enough attention. Next, please. All right, when we talk about the credit worthiness of the tenant, Kathy preaches about this all the time. It's not just the rent per foot. It's not just, gee, it's $20 a foot or $28 a foot, or, you know, in the West Coast, it's, you know, $240 per month, triple net. What is the ratio of the rent to the tuition revenue? And we like to say 15% or less at 70% occupancy. And that really is a better indicator of the sustainability of the rent payable to the building owner. Secondly, we want to know what's the financial condition of the tenant, and if there's a guarantor, what is their financial condition? We see a lot of buildings coming to the market where there's a franchise person and they have all the good intentions in the world. They spend a lot of money to buy into the franchise, and their franchise home office company doesn't have much of a guarantee. That would make me nervous. Sometimes there's ceilings on the amount of damages that you can chase from a guarantor. That would make me nervous. Next. We talked about the cost of money already. For those of you who are in the market, you probably have awkward conversations with your banker where they're not willing to give more than 70% loan to value. Maybe it's 75, but the price of that money's gone from 4 to 6 to 8. SBA financing, you can get higher loan to value ratios, but the fees are high, the processing is brain damage, and the interest rates are 8 to 9. We hear that, that in some cases they're double digits. SBA is a great source for those who are starting out and those who have a blemish. But there's no question that the price of money has increased. Next, please. All right, let's talk about some of the psychological aspects. Let's say you're a buyer. You sold your school building and your business to somebody else, and you want to do a 1031 exchange, and you're looking at another childcare building to buy. Basic questions. Why is it for sale? What's going on there? Are we doing a sale leaseback? Is it, tell us about the quality of the tenant. Let's understand the why. And as the buyer, be prepared to answer the same question. How much time is left on the lease? We see a fair number of buildings coming to market where there's 4, 5, or 6 years left on the lease. That feels risky to me because the smart landlord should go to that tenant ahead of time and renew that lease so that there's at least 10 years before it comes to market. We've seen some properties on the market where there's only 1 or 2 years left on the lease. I have to assume the landlord tried to extend it. They couldn't. I feel like the proper underwriting is to assume the tenant's going to leave. On the other hand, if it's a brand new building, it's a build to suit, there's 15 years left on the lease, I think that landlord's going to be pretty proud. That certainty of the lease performance is probably very high. I would think that would command a high price. We talked about alternative uses, and we talked about the profile of the buyer. Let's say you're the owner of the building and you get a 1031 buyer who wants to buy your building. While they have a high motivation to close, they don't want to pay taxes. However, they may be shopping multiple other buildings in addition to yours. And they may be unsophisticated and you'll have to hold their hand through the process. We want you to understand the psychological as well as the technical aspects in the real estate transaction. Next, please. So here's some opportunities here. If you've been around Hinge, you know that we talk all the time about what do you do when you're ready to sell your school. And if you own the building, these don't apply if you're leasing it from somebody else. If you own the business and the building, you could decide to do both. Sell the business, sell the property. It gives you more control over the transaction. Or you may like the idea of owning real estate, and you could sell the business and lease the building to the business buyer. Lots of positive aspects about that if you're willing to be the landlord. And in most cases, we can help you together with your legal team and accounting team to structure a lease that's pretty foolproof, where you don't have to deal with management and maintenance. We also have people who say, I'm pretty good at running the business. I don't want real estate on my balance sheet. I'm going to sell these buildings, bring in more money, and grow by offloading some of the bricks and mortar. Finally, in a lower interest rate environment, we see people who want to refinance their building. I'm not sure refinancing is in the cards right now, but it is an option. Next, please. So if you're the investor, what should you pay attention to? I think that there's should be a higher focus on the quality of the tenant. I'm a little bit surprised when I call real estate brokers around the country and they have various buildings for sale And I'll ask about the credit quality of the tenant or how many students are in the building or the financials of the tenant. And I'm constantly surprised at the lack of information or education or knowledge of those brokers with respect to the tenant in the building that's paying the rent. And so you have to ask yourself, do your own research. Is the tenant actually going to make it to the end of the lease? Are they going to thrive? Is there a guarantor? What is their credit standing? What is their connection to the tenant? Can you achieve a higher yield by choosing a different tenant? Where are you on the risk gradient? If you just want to put it on the bookshelf and don't worry about it, you're probably seeking a high credit tenant in a strong top 10 metro market. You don't care that much about the cap rate yield and you want certainty. On the other hand, at the other far end, you probably can live with a deal where there's 2 years left on the lease. It's in a secondary or tertiary market. Maybe you have other buildings or you have other operators in your back pocket and you can backfill and you need a yield play. Where are you on that spectrum? If you're looking to buy a building and you don't like interest rates, maybe the seller wants to avoid tax and do an installment sale where the seller will carry back the mortgage. Or if you're a patient investor and you don't like the current economic climate, maybe it's okay to wait. Doing nothing isn't always an option. Maybe waiting it out, surveying the market, that might bear fruit. Next, please. All right, here's our summary. I think cap rates are likely to increase a little bit. Even if the cost of money does not, I feel like the cap rate lag effect is going to result in a steady increase in cap rates. I just don't see how owners of real estate can, or buyers of real estate can survive in a market where the price of money is greater than the cap rate yield. That math doesn't work. You can see we talk to folks whose job it is to buy real estate for their portfolios. Those are the public real estate companies. They sell stock to investors. The investors earn a dividend, and the difference between the cost of the dividend, or the math is the cost of the dividend plus the administrative costs plus the company's profit needs to equal the yield that they offer to the buyer. In talking with those folks, their requirements have increased from 7% range to the low to mid 8% range. We talked about this third bullet point. School operators who own their real estate have more control over the exit of the business than school operators who must get consent of a random third-party landlord. Next, please. So for those who are growing with an outside build-to-suit developer, please take some time to understand that developer's qualifications, their contingency factor, their price of money. Let's make sure your specs and blueprints are exquisitely detailed. The whole point of doing all the work ahead of time is to avoid disputes. You know, prior planning makes for poor results. That's so true in construction. It's a lot easier to make changes on paper than to make changes on a job site. We really encourage people to look at when they own the business and the real estate. Both Kathy and myself and many of our clients are fans of real estate. It makes for a wonderful family wealth building vehicle, provided that you have the right lease with the right tenant. I don't think it's necessary to sell the business and the building unless there's other dynamics in your family goals. You know, for example, I do have older clients that say, I want out, I don't want to take the risk, and I'm getting rid of everything. That works fine. But real estate does have many wealth building opportunities if you're comfortable with the risk. So again, it's a risk reward. It's a risk reward as well as what's best for your family. We have lots of operators who are seeking dark buildings or empty buildings, and they're willing to take the risk that they can renovate these buildings and convert them into a school and open for business. So there's a lot to be said for growing your company by finding old churches or large open space like former gyms, where those buildings can be converted. Again, where are you on the risk spectrum? Because you're going to put a lot of money into those buildings and you need to get a license before you open for business. However, that is a strategy we see many of our clients pursue. As always, we're here to talk through it with you and brainstorm, and we love talking to our clients around the country.
Mike, that was fantastic. Thank you. We have about 4 minutes and some fantastic questions. So like Mike said, if we don't get to your question, please reach out. We're always happy to support and brainstorm possibilities. So Mike, are there investment companies that would be willing to purchase properties? Would they do build to suit and lease back to operators?
Yes, there are many investment companies that do want to invest in childcare properties. I'll be happy to discuss that with you, or Kathy will. There's a wide variety of them, and each one is suited for a particular type of tenant, a particular geography, and we, of course, would like to obtain the best possible pricing for you. So the answer is yes, and the details are to be figured out.
Thank you, Mike. Has there been a rise in corporate or national purchases of existing as opposed to new construction? So have we seen a flip to purchasing existing real estate as opposed to new construction?
I don't think I've seen a flip. I think there's a constant demand. I think that the new shiny buildings get a lot of attention because there's usually 15 years or 10 years left on the lease. I think that sometimes, however, with those new buildings, you'll have a franchise operator in there, and that may or may not represent a good credit opportunity. Some of the older existing buildings have benefits because there's an established track record of occupancy and performance. So I wouldn't say there's a flip. I think that each deal will stand on its own, but some of the ideas that we've talked about here need to be examined on any of the transactions that you're looking at.
Yeah, good comments, Mike. I'll add to that the national and super regional groups have huge new development programs going on. They also acquire, but I don't think we've ever seen new sites and new builds quite as robust as they are right now. You're going to see a continued move into new markets and in building out markets in the next couple of years. One more. There's an interest to have a couple of properties to look at. Reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you more about that. I want to thank Mike. I had a couple of questions too, Mike, but I'll see you later.
All right.
And thank I really appreciate this topic. We believe that your real estate and your ability to use real estate to build wealth, to operate your school better, or to grow your company by not owning real estate or flipping real estate into new opportunities. So there are so many different ways to use your real estate. And like Mike said, those ways change at different stages of your company. So it really takes a customized approach to whatever it is, wherever you are, what your objectives are for growth, and where we are in the stage of opportunities for what you can do with real estate. But Thank you, everyone, for joining. Again, please reach out. This recording will be available in our archives. So review it again if you need to, and we will look forward to seeing you guys soon. Take care. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.